Okay, it's 1:02, so I'll go ahead and get us going, Breanne. Hello, everyone. My name is Yvonne Mary, and I'm a librarian at the University of Arizona. And I'd like to welcome everyone to this presentation titled Complicity in Assimilating Students to Eurocentric Scholarship. This session is being recorded. There are a lot of folks here today, but we should be able to get to all the questions. Please put your questions in the chat. I will be monitoring them and then helping Breanne with them. There's also live transcript is enabled, but you need to go ahead and turn that on for yourself if you want to have the live transcript. Your presenter today is Breanne Crumpton. Her pronouns are she, her. She is the information literacy librarian for humanities at Appalachian State University. And I will hand it over to Breanne.
Thank you and good afternoon. So before I dive into the contents of my presentation today, I wanted to sit with this title for a few moments. I'm pretty sure I wrote my proposal in like a moment of frustration. I remember when I got accepted, I went back and looked at the title that I'd written. I was like, oh, it's pretty harsh, you know, thinking about complicity and assimilation. But naturally, I didn't really think to change it because while I think complicity and assimilation are not really that comfortable words to sit with, they can sometimes get us thinking in new and different lights that might ultimately lead to change. And some of my frustrations with the constraints of higher education, a lot of the points that have been touched upon in other presentations within the symposium kind of continue. And I thought this would be a good way to embrace that frustration as opposed to gloss over it. I wanted to start out with a quote from Flawed as well with her work on vocational awe. So vocational awe refers to the set of ideas, values, and assumptions librarians have about themselves and the profession that result in beliefs that libraries are, as institutions, are inherently good and sacred and therefore beyond critique. And the emphasis here is mine. And the reason I wanted to bring in this quote is because in my experience, I've seen several librarians take on this vocational awe idea when it comes to information literacy instruction. We are teaching students how to get what they need to be successful, and therefore the work is inherently good. And the majority of criticisms with our instruction sometimes can stem from more external forces, such as the limited amount of time we have in the one shot or not being taken seriously by faculty, rather than some of our actual practices. Now, I think critical information literacy has definitely been an area where these critiques are being levied, and I would go out on a limb to say a lot of people here are looking to kind of look at our practices and levy these critiques against how we operate within these systems sometimes. But I also want to bring in this quote by Ian Phelan, who states, "It is a main tenet of critical information literacy that information literacy instruction should resist the tendency to reinforce and reproduce hegemonic knowledge and instead nurture students' understanding of how information and knowledge are formed by unequal power relations based on class, race, gender, and sexuality." Again, emphasis is mine. So we should be resisting reproducing hegemonic knowledge, but as Phelan and others continue to write, a lot of our practices and approaches to information literacy actually help us to continue to be complicit in assimilating students to Eurocentric knowledge rather than fighting it. And so part of what I wanted to do with the presentation today is kind of just name what Eurocentric scholarship is, so we can be thinking more about the ways in which our work and the structures that we kind of have to work within are helping assimilate students to it. Before I do that, I wanted to do two things. First, as I will be discussing Eurocentric scholarship, I want to make a brief acknowledgement of the stolen lands on which I'm currently presenting from. So the native people, including the Cherokee and the Catawba, lived, hunted, and traded in this region long before the colonization of North America. Appalachian State University recognizes the indigenous people of the lands now called North Carolina. And for anyone who's not familiar with Appalachian State University, we're actually in the mountains on the western part of North Carolina. And we acknowledge the displacement, disposition, and continuing presence. And this version of the statement actually comes from our English department, and I use those since it highlights the disposition and displacement element. I also want to preface this with my own positionality and background and context surrounding some of the presentation. Namely, I'm a white, cisgendered, able-bodied female from a middle-class upbringing with a wealth of privilege behind me. My job as a faculty librarian also grants me the time to do research and scholarship among my other job duties. And I'll be speaking today from both my experiences and viewpoints, as well as some literature grounding that can be seen in kind of my works cited, or what I call my research journey, at the end of the presentation. I'll also acknowledge that there is likely relevant literature and perspectives out there that might be helpful in this subject matter that I might not have had time to discover or read. So this can be merely a snapshot of the voices that can be heard on this topic. So I thought to build an interaction with this presentation, I'd have a few reflective questions kind of sprinkled throughout the presentation. And so I'm going to start with this one. What is Eurocentric scholarship? What do you see are the characteristics of Eurocentric scholarship? And what do you mean? What do they mean to you? And we can just use the chat to kind of put in some answers to this. But I'll give a minute for you all to think on this. What is Eurocentric scholarship? How do you define it? Yeah, so I'm seeing a lot of great answers here. I like Paige's answer. Scholarship is simply scholarship without needing to define it because it's the dominant position of Eurocentric. It's kind of default of US academia. And so the literal definition, feel free to keep adding things in the chat, but we can think of it as scholarship that centers that European and Western perspective. And in trying to define specific characteristics of Eurocentric scholarship beyond a geographical component, I had a challenge finding a definition that I felt really spoke to actually pinpointing exact characteristics of Eurocentric scholarship. So in trying to define it for this presentation, because this could, as some of you mentioned, speak to the invisible and pervasive nature of whiteness that kind of underlines the scholarship, I wanted to look at it through a few lenses instead. So, excuse me. So the first lens is through settler colonialism. So settler colonialism is an ongoing state in which we find ourselves. I have a small cold trying to get through, but and although we don't call any parts of the United States colonies anymore, we are still inhabiting stolen lands and benefiting off the results of the colonialization of Great Britain. So settler colonialism includes interlocking forms of oppression and racism, white supremacy, heteropatriarchy, and capitalism. And this is because settler colonials are Eurocentric and assume the European values with respect to ethnic, and assume that European values with respect to ethnic and therefore moral superiority are inevitable and natural. So this lens helps ground us on where our value systems have historically come from, both socially and within higher education. We can see our European roots and what gets valued in terms of the systems of white supremacy and capitalism. And I'll come back to those in just a moment. So on the flip side of this, the second lens is looking at the growing calls for decolonization in research and academia. And decolonization studies seek to legitimize and uplift other knowledge systems, particularly indigenous ways of knowing. And let's see, I'm sorry. And in doing so, you start to define to an extent what Western knowledge systems are. So Western knowledge can be seen as emphasizing logic, rationality, objectivity, and the measurement of observable phenomenon. Western science in particular is criticized for being human-centric. And while there are some comparable research methodologies between the two ways of thinking, for example, a feminist theorist use of storytelling, Western thought still features predominantly in most fields of study. So then a third lens, kind of expanding off the first one, is looking at Western scholarship as it upholds characteristics of white supremacy as examined by Tima Occam. And Occam writes on a website that she uses the term white supremacy to refer to the ways that our elite of the original 13 colonies used a pseudo-scientific concept of race to create a racialized hierarchy. And she goes on to state, white supremacy colonizes our minds. White supremacy tells us who has value, who doesn't, what has value, what doesn't, in ways that reinforce a racial hierarchy of power and controls that diseases and destroys all it touches. So I wanted to touch on some specific characteristic Occam highlights as it plays out in scholarship. So the first is one right way. This is the belief that there is one right way to do things, and once people are introduced to the right way, they will see the light and adopt it. So, excuse me, if they don't adopt the one right way, then there's something that is wrong with them as opposed to something wrong with our system. So in scholarship, this can manifest itself into following established research methodologies of a discipline or writing and citing in the proper way, ideas and approaches that go outside the mainstream. So publishing outside of peer-reviewed journals, writing about experiences through blogs, looking at systems of communal knowledge creation, such as Wikipedia, get devalued. Another characteristic is quantity over quality. So this characteristic deals with discomfort with emotion and feeling. So going back to how decolonization looks at Western knowledge as being very objective in nature. There's also an emphasis on value that is measurable and quantitative, and that things that can be counted are more highly valued than things that can't. So thinking about impact metrics when we look at citation data and to measure a journal or an author's impact in a field and how this can play into people getting promotion and tenure. So if your work is not seen as impactful or you're not publishing in high impact places, you're not seen as successfully contributing to that field. And additionally, one not really listed on the slide, but a tie to short-term thinking and urgency thinking and meeting unrealistic quantitative goals. So for example, say having faculty say students need X number of sources for the paper, like that will determine the quality of the paper. And students, as we see a lot in our practice, are most times just trying to fill that quota. There's the characteristic progress is bigger and more, which is valuing those who have progressed over those who have not. Where progress is measured in degrees, grades, money, power, status, material belongings, in ways that erase lived experience and wisdom knowledge that is invisibilized. So authority often gets discussed in terms of authors' credentials, the degrees they have, the organizational affiliation. So if you have the money and privilege to get advanced degrees and work within higher education, your work is automatically seen as more authoritative in a lot of cases within higher education. And then finally, a characteristic on the worship of the written word. So Eurocentric scholarship requires things to be properly cited according to established documentation standards. If it is not properly cited according to academic rules that many people don't know or have access to, it's not legitimate. Additionally, those who write with proper English grammar and cite correctly based on documentation standards often end up getting higher grades in classes. And to continue with this one, there's also the inability or refusal to acknowledge information that is shared through stories, embodied knowing, intuition. And if you cannot back up your observation with other scholars, it's not seen as reliable. And then the academic standards require original work when your knowledge builds on the knowledge, and knowing of others. So once an article or book is published, it gets treated and cited as an original work, regardless of how many people it cited, whose work it was building off of, and this can sometimes lead to erasure in fields. And then a fourth lens is neo-capitalism, and individualism is also a characteristic of white supremacy. This kind of lends itself to neo-capitalism and higher education. Higher education, scholarship, and information have become a commodity as of late. Neoliberal capitalism can be characterized by placing value on an individual's employability and converting human activity into market-based value. It largely extends to the commodification of information and established systems of hierarchy that allow some voices to strive over others. We might best sum up this lens as the system that puts value on what is publishable and profitable to large market players, and individuals are measured based on their ability to contribute to the market in a positive way. So with all that in mind, all those four lenses, I define Eurocentric scholarship as the following: scholarship that has been established through the historical colonial values of Western Europe and places value on logical, objective, publishable, and profitable scholarship through following established rules of engagement in writing and documentation. So I'm going to take a pause here and ask you all, in what way are students assimilated to Eurocentric scholarship? I think some of the earlier answers kind of allude to this, but let's go ahead and answer this question as well. And we can do this in the chat too. So we have a few people talking about how they are only required to use peer-reviewed sources, assignment guidelines, not acknowledging scholarship is inherently Eurocentric, not acknowledging or counting other ways of knowing as legitimate knowledge, instilling a fear of academic dishonesty, vague citation standards. So I think I capture most, if not all of these as well. So none of this is really novel ideas, but thinking through actually like having to state it sometimes makes a bigger impact. So students, as many of you mentioned, are largely assimilated to value and mimic Eurocentric scholarship through the research assignments that faculty assign. Students get graded on how well they write, what they cite, and using proper documentation standards. And faculty will largely teach based on how they were taught. And this kind of perpetuates some of the values of Eurocentric scholarship that have been around higher education for a long time. So this brings us to the ugly word of the title, the complicit, and us being complicit. So let's reflect on our own practices for a few times, and thank you all for continuing to putting things in the chat. But another question for you all: what topics do faculty usually ask you to cover in information literacy sections? What are you being asked to teach those students? So I informally asked some colleagues of mine about what topics faculty members asked them to cover, and I think they largely aligned with what you all put in the chat as well. So the ones that come to the surface a lot is helping students find peer-reviewed sources, articles, or good sources, as someone said, and making sure students understand the difference between types of sources, so popular versus scholarly, evaluating sources, how to cite sources, and then how to use our library databases and resources. So I'll reiterate a lot of what I might talk about moving forward are generalizations and ones based on my own observations and experiences. But even within the rise of critical information literacy, I see some of these still being a common thread in a lot of one-shot sessions. But let's look at this first one, this helping students find peer-reviewed articles. So why are peer-reviewed sources important? Why is this a topic we get asked to teach on a lot? So valid and credibility of research, so seen as credible. Faculty member wants you to accidentally stumble on the article. That made me laugh. Legitimate research requires legitimate sources. System we perpetrate daily, yes. And assumptions that peer review is the golden standard of information. So peer-reviewed articles are oftentimes seen as the most credible. And for the most part, we can reinforce this teaching or this message to students when we're trying to meet what the faculty want us to address. So peer-reviewed articles, though, and scholarly articles are kind of that quintessential form of Eurocentric scholarship, as I think a few of you have alluded to. And peer-reviewed articles and peer-reviewed itself kind of has roots going back to the Royal Society of London. There's a great chapter in a book that's part of my work cited by Kathleen Fitzpatrick, and she's talking about how peer review came out in the Royal Society of London, but it was more about censorship. They didn't want people writing heresy against the state, and it really hasn't transformed into this what is considered a quality control method until this past century, really. And then peer-reviewed articles, they heavily rely on citations. So citations are a heavy marker that an article is scholarly. So this is reinforcing that objectivity of Western ways of knowing on behalf of the author, and them showing that they're grounding their research and their findings in works of others. So again, like storytelling, emotions, these things you can't really ground, so they don't really belong in these articles. The articles are usually expected to follow documentation styles that I'm sure we've all spoken to, APA, MLA, Chicago, and other established guidelines by the publisher. Peer review articles usually have an original idea or thesis to them, and they are tied as commodities in the credentialing process. So peer-reviewed scholarship is usually the top level scholarship that faculty are expected to produce across different disciplines. So there's that assumption that they are high quality and that they've been thoroughly tested and vetted with them. And we often juxtapose peer-reviewed or scholarly sources next to popular ones to show the difference between the two. And the rhetoric around how these differences are presented show a certain favoritism towards one over the other. We usually emphasize that, again, scholarly works are written by experts and popular sources are not. So minimizing any qualification the author of popular sources might have. We might talk about how the audience is different, which somehow can change the value of the information. We might emphasize that popular sources can be biased, as if this peer-reviewed process that we're kind of holding up as this golden standard is automatically unbiased. though I'm not really sure an unbiased source exists, but again, reiterating that objective value of Eurocentric scholarship. And finally, big thing we might note, and one that is easily to look at for students to look at and glance at, is the lack of citation in popular sources, which we can use to then question their quality. So there's the argument that in discussing popular versus scholarly, it's really about differentiating how different sources might meet different information needs. However, we know that from faculty request, the information need is usually scholarly. So rhetoric usually is geared towards boosting those sources as the ones students should be looking at to get the quality information that they need. And we'll uphold peer-reviewed articles placed in the hierarchy to such a degree sometimes that we, and again, these are generalizations, we often don't find the need to have any critical discussions around peer-reviewed. So we might check that students know the definition, that it's a process of something being looked at by others in the field. Then we'll point them to contextual clues in our databases to help them kind of checkbox their way to quality and remove any need for them to critically think about if the source is good enough for the paper beyond relevancy. Students sometimes assume that because it's peer-reviewed, they can't argue against it. But we know that's not true. This is just something that our rhetoric can imply. But peer reviews, we know, are not immune to being redacted for bad information. There's a whole retraction watch blog that shows. But if we don't talk about the pitfalls and negative impacts of peer-reviewed journals, students aren't going to know any better. And they're going to think that these are just really the top quality sources. But those bias that exist in peer review articles, there's bias in the editor, the peer reviewers, the peer review selection process. How are peer reviewers picked? Or is it voluntary? What does it mean for someone to get for the quality of the feedback an author might get? And these are legitimate questions. I would like to explore more about how peer reviewers actually get selected and how they're determined to be good experts on an article. If this is a system that we're popping up, we probably should know a little more about it. But I think these are varies depending on the publisher and kind of hidden processes sometimes. So in thinking through, so I might have gotten off on my slides here. Thinking through how we hold up peer-reviewed journals, largely because that's what faculty are asking us to. This can be a place that we're kind of complicit, and our databases help with this a lot, that we're being asked to show. They have little peer-reviewed checkboxes. They have the little indicators of what's peer-reviewed, and they kind of do that checking for us of if the journal is peer-reviewed or not. So let's think of the next kind of topic that we're asked to talk on a lot. So what factors do you have students focus on in evaluating sources? All right, so I see whether someone's trying to tell you something, so audience and purpose, using a rubric to help them decide for themselves if something's useful, faculty expectations again, and kind of the assignment, looking at source identity, so citation justice as some things. So commonly, what I've seen in our practices, so someone just mentioned too, the CRAP test and SIFT. So we ask students to evaluate sources on what we ask students to evaluate sources on can have them looking at things from logical, objective kind of indicators of Western ways of knowing sometimes. And the characteristics and the quantitative characteristics of white supremacy, particularly when it comes to the author, as well as the accuracy or bias of a source. So for example, with authors, we emphasize that they need to be an expert on the topic, which usually means considering authority through their credentials, institutional affiliation, or prior publications to determine if they are qualified to write on a source, and if they have cited those sources correctly. So Mott and Cockle state acknowledging citation as a form of performativity that uncritically reproduces sameness means accounting for how the authority of the author is confirmed or denied by their ability to cite or to cite in a particular way. So they argue against using citation as a metric of impact, excellence, or assumed authority as the practice can privilege established voices in the field over early career scholars or graduates who might be bringing new and experimental ideas to the field, as well as non-academics whose knowledge the academy doesn't recognize in the same manner. So along with authority, I think, citational politics is something that's growing, but looking, as someone mentioned, at the identities of sources isn't something we usually ask students to do, as I would say a broad practice, but looking at kind of that progress, who has progressed, who has the degrees, who's been able to publish in the field, can be some of the questions that we kind of prompt them with. And then in terms of like accuracy, are the facts always backed up with citations? Popular sources usually fall flat with this because they might like reference a study, but their editorial process doesn't make room or prioritize citations, and can make peer-reviewed sources seem automatically, again, right and unbiased. And the purpose, if they're trying to sell you something, again, I think there's still, when we talk about bias within sources, I think there's still a lot of bias within peer-reviewed that we don't always discuss. The SIF method has been gaining popularity, but it can largely be geared towards media and online information. And like other evaluation acronyms, it can build upon asking questions that seem rhetorical in nature. So can you find a better source? Is the author qualified to write about the topic? And these questions seem to be pushing students towards sometimes unnamed answers that might be emphasizing objectivity and logic that students might not be equipped to fully answer on their own. And then once a source is determined to be good, they need to cite it. So we can spend a lot of time and one shot showing students how to grab citations for sources. Excuse me. We might even use the cite tools in our databases. Give me just a second. Apologies, I told you I was getting over a cold, but anyways, we show them the cite tools in our databases, and this might be a way that we promote our databases over other web sources. So a lot of the times we put strong emphasis on making sure the format for the citation is correct, even when using our citation tools. And this comes back to that emphasis on the written word of white supremacy. Citations themselves can be a superficial form of engagement. And we can see students just looking for sources to back up their opinion sometimes. So while citing is meant to be shown as them being objective, we know it can be performative in how they're carried out. And I think someone mentioned earlier, we can doctor them in a way that's, if you don't cite correctly, you're a bad person because you're plagiarizing. Our standard documentation styles are also Eurocentric and hegemonic. So for APA, sorry, I'm struggling, y'all. They talk about when you need to cite elders or knowledge keepers in communities. They give you a way to cite it as a personal communication, but because of that, it doesn't require entry in your reference list. And so we can see it's not being valued at the same level as other sources. So some people have taken it upon themselves, the LibGuides out there, to offer ways to include this type of knowledge in reference sources, but by and large, the official standards don't adequately guide scholars in how to recognize non-Western knowledge. So, next question. How often do you incorporate databases into your instruction? So most of the times when we do information literacy instruction, we're using our databases to show them how to find these sources. And in one shot, we can often spend a lot of time showing students how to navigate the databases we have purchased to find those peer-reviewed sources we are expecting them to cite in their papers. Joshua Beatley states, librarians make these databases a virtue, telling students that by using them, they will find only reliable sources. So he describes how information has been organized into these walled gardens, paywalls, that have segregated the reliable information from the rest of the internet. Or at least that's how we can sometimes pitch them in our rhetoric. In treating our databases as solutions to the cost of information, you know, you can get these articles for free through the library, that's the website's asking you to pay for money, instead of actually addressing the underlying problem of how information has been commodified. We can help to reinforce the hierarchy that the current information marketplace establishes within higher education. And OA, open access, and OER are two trends that have grown out of trying to address the problem of rising cost of publications, particularly when it comes to textbooks. But we still speak to those sources with skepticism sometimes. If the OA journal is not in our databases, or it's on the open web, it needs to be looked at over carefully because it could be predatory. This fear being another characteristic of white supremacy around predatory journals in particular, can drive a lot of this uncertainty about if open access articles are really quality or not. Yeah, and as Rebecca talks about in the chat, open access might be free to access, but those article publication charges that get accompanied with it. So it's not really free. And I know within our institution, like, we'll pay for our faculty to publish an OA, but we're still paying it. It's still being charged at some point. And OA is being co-opted by corporate publishers, as Paige mentions as well. So what? So this one isn't necessarily for you all, but in general with this presentation, you know, Eurocentric scholarship is the bread and butter of our current higher education systems. Students get assimilated to the scholarship through their faculty and coursework. We support the classes and in turn help to emphasize the importance of peer-reviewed work over other source types, proper citation techniques and use as quality indicators, and uplifting the commodification of information through buying into paywall systems. And the peer review process, politics of citation, neoliberal tendency of our information systems can uplift voices that play into Eurocentric thoughts and values and downplay other voices and ways of knowing. This is how we are complicit, but this is also very much the state of higher education and academia. So what can be even done about it, especially with all the politics and these systems that go on? It's one of those where you have to kind of play the system, so to speak, but I think there's a few possible paths forward that I see. So first of all, I think like with a lot of DEI work, the ability to name the system. So as we kind of talked about today, Eurocentric part of scholarship, that Eurocentric part can be very invisible or assumed because it's the dominant system. But it's important to be able to articulate what it looks like and what the systems are that we're kind of operating within. I think also focusing a lot of our efforts around faculty. So a lot of the reason that we're kind of complicit is because we're trying to appease to faculty because we need them to measure our own performance and assess our value of our work. But when we talk about the challenges to implementing ideas in most threshold concepts, we get stuck on talking about the limitations of one shot in terms of limited time to engage students and explore any topic in depth. Students also may or may not be interested or care when our topic, if we go off topic from when they need to complete the assignment. So if we're playing the system and kind of talking about peer-reviewed sources that students need, and we try to go off script a little, talk about, you know, the downsides of peer-reviewed, or maybe looking at who's being cited, students don't always, it's hard to get students to engage sometimes. And I think part of this is because students do care about their grades, but they mostly care about the faculty. I think faculty are our biggest in to students. And so we should focus more of our efforts on making sure faculty understand critical information literacy within the best of our ability. I don't think we're going to get every faculty on board. Some are just going to do their own thing, but where we can make inroads, I think would be really beneficial in kind of learning to speak their language as well as in looking at issues in their field. The OA and the ER and OER movement, again, I think are big opportunities to kind of help get around some of these paid ward systems, although as people have mentioned in the chat, there are still issues with them. But if we want to think of maybe what a real open information commons might look like, and I'm tempted to say Wikipedia that has records of all the edits made to the articles, thinking about what OA and OER could look like that would actually be open to everyone, not have these hidden charges that are associated with them, but open up the information commons. And then I think also being like conscientious about our promotion. So as a liaison to different departments, you might think about who's being erased or undercited in that particular field. And learning the politics, are there certain journals that need to get uplifted in a field, like helping faculty. I think a lot of faculty want to incorporate diverse voices into the curriculum, especially white faculty. They don't always know where to look. So, but that's something we can do. We can help point out lesser known publications that have more diversity within them. We can talk about pros and cons to impact factors if that's something that gets promoted a lot in the field. And I think faculty feel the pressure of these systems as well. So showing that we understand what they're going through can also help us support them maybe in unexpected ways. And then I can't really sit here and tell you what will and won't be successful. I mean, as Paige rightly says, it's hard to play the game while trying to reform the game. But what I attempted to do is at least show you the current systems that we find ourselves to be a part of, and some of us already know this. What I do though, I want to ask you to, dare to critique our profession more and the ways that we approach some of faculty requests. I think we have more legs to stand on than we give ourselves credit for sometimes. And we can get up in that, we get caught up in that quantitative assessment too, that we need all these classes, that it prohibits us from being really experimental sometimes. So, and also, daring to dream of what higher education and academic libraries would look like if we decentered Eurocentric scholarship. It's hard to envision right now. We're stuck in these systems, but if we can think about what it could look like in an ideal world, maybe that's something that we can start striving towards. So I just want to leave with a few thoughts here, and then we have like a few minutes for questions, but what if we push back on vendor prices and the information capitalism? What if we talked about other forms of knowledge with the same reverence that we give to peer reviewed? What if we understand students' information literacy skills and approaches to research on their terms instead of insisting on a right way? What if academic libraries really were places that uplifted voices that were being oppressed and aimed to really liberate information from the paywall pockets of our current ecosystem? So what if? And so for my works cited, and I'll be making my slides available, but I decided to put it into a Padlet. And the reason I did this was to make it more relational, because I think sometimes the works cited pages that we form as part of our documentation make individual works really rely on that meritocracy of individual works. And I wanted to make mine a little more relational. And let me see if I just click into it. And so I kind of grouped it by like subjects. And I also noted ones that I have not read yet. So research is a journey, scholarship is a conversation. So the orange ones are ones that have interest to me, but I haven't read. But again, these will be part of my slides. And I'll open the floor to any questions in the last few minutes. And I apologize when my voice gave out a few times. Hey, Paige. Yeah, so I think part of my frustration stems from always having to show databases within information literacy instruction. I feel like I'm more of a database, like a vendor, salesperson sometimes than a teacher. And these are tools that I know students won't have when they graduate. A lot of students aren't necessarily going into graduate school, or they're going into professions where they're going to be relying on different types of information. And so it frustrates me to spend so much time on our databases and the kind of these peer-reviewed systems when that might not be what they need further on in life. It might be what they need momentarily, but not further on in life. Let me see if I can add this Padlet here. Yes, you're welcome to email me. I'll drop my email in the chat. Again, but that's some of my frustrations, and then just kind of a lot of the reading, I think, helps when you see more of the systems that we operate within. They can lead to a little frustrations with just the systems that we're kind of part of. Thank you all for coming.
Okay, it looks like we're just at about 1:50. There doesn't look to be any more questions. So I'm going to go ahead and say, again, thank you, Breanne, for presenting. That was very, very eye-opening, very interesting. I love the Padlet too. So thank you, everyone, for coming. And thank you, Breanne. Bye-bye, everyone.
Thank you.